Good morning and welcome to Mass Memorial Virtual Sunday School. Theme for the quarter, Faith That Pleases God. Unit 2, Grace and Reconciliation. Sunday, January 18, 2026. Lesson title, A Time to Be Bold, A Time to Be Humble. Our scriptures are from Genesis 18, 25 through 27, 30 to 32, Luke 18, 9 through 14, 1 John 5, 14, 15, King James Version. Our key verse, I tell you, this man went down to his house justified rather than the other. For everyone that exalteth himself shall be abased, and that he that humbleth himself shall be exalted. Luke 18, 14, King James Version. The aim for this lesson is to contrast boldness in prayer, such as in Genesis 10 or 1 John, with humility in prayer, such as the tax collector in Luke. The other aim is to pray, with the confidence that God hears our prayers. Boldly share the gospel while staying humble in your community. A little bit about our lesson background, not going into too much detail, because we've covered many of these books before. The book of Genesis is the first book in the Old Testament and one of the 5 books of law. And those 5 books are Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Our lesson is from Genesis 18, which deals with Abraham's confident intercession for Sodom and Gomorrah, trusting God to spare these cities for a minimum number of righteous people. And this is an interesting point in our lesson. Sodom and Gomorrah, one of the most sinful cities ever to exist. And then we go to the book of Luke. This is a New Testament book which contains many parables about Jesus' teachings on humility, faith, and the kingdom of God in our lesson. It shows the tax collector's confidence in God and his plea for mercy, trusting that only God could grant what he did not deserve. So we'll cover that extensively when we get into characteristics that you should have when you humbly go before God. The book of 1 John is written to help believers to stay grounded in the core truths of Christian faith. John focuses on 3 genuine faith: living in obedience to God, showing love for others, and holding on to the truths about who Jesus is. Our lesson background continue. We have 3 important words that show up in our lesson and that will play a part in how we look at things today. One of those characteristics is vanity, which means thinking too highly of oneself. And believe it or not, this is very, very common. We have people that, as the old saying says, they are it. They come before anybody else. They are above all others. The other word that comes forth in our lesson is pride, which is being overly focused on your own importance, which often leads to people ignoring or rejecting God and his grace, taking credit for things that belong to him. So I think there's one scripture that says pride goes before destruction. And pride oftentimes causes us to fail to forgive, fail to acknowledge what we do wrong, fail to realize that we have flaws, that we have sin. Pride would also lead you to think that I don't sin, or I have no sin, I haven't done anything wrong. But if you remember our previous lesson where it says, a man who says he hadn't sinned is a liar, and the truth is not in him. So the next word that comes forth in our lesson is humility. Humility means having an accurate, modest view of yourself, recognizing your strength and weaknesses without arrogance, valuing others equally or above yourself. And this is hard to do for some people. They can't see themselves humanly equal to their fellow man, and they become arrogant, and they get a different view of themselves. They become authoritarians. they become narcissistic, start to betray all the characteristic that goes against what God would have us to do as Christians. So, moving on to our lesson scriptures. These scriptures we've heard before used in different manners. And our first set of scriptures, confident boldness in prayer. It comes from Genesis 18:25 through 27, 30-32, 1 John 5:14 and 15, King James Version. I'm going to read Genesis 18:25 through 27. Genesis 18:25. That be far from thee to do after this manner, to slay the righteous with the wicked, and that the righteous should be as the wicked. That far from thee shall not the judge of all earth do right. Genesis 18:26. And the Lord said, if I find in Sodom 50 righteous within the city, then I will spare all the place for their sakes. Genesis 18:27. And Abraham answered and said, behold, now I have taken upon thee to speak unto the Lord, which am but dust and ashes. These three verses are so important because, in a sense, God appealed to Abraham and told him what his plan was. His plan was to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. And so, what Abraham did in response to what God said, he began a bold intercession, as if he was challenging God's decision because he couldn't understand the idea of the righteous perishing along with the wicked, asserting that this was uncharacteristic of God's character. Even Abraham challenged God. He was still able to acknowledge God's sovereignty and moral authority. He also recognized his own significance and unworthiness. And these last few words help us to understand that there was such a good relationship between Abraham and God. Abraham felt he could go to him, but he didn't go to God in arrogance, saying, why are you doing this? You know how we like to challenge authority and say, why are you doing something? And then basically Abraham did that. And when we think of things that go on now, we think about it. We do challenge sometimes and say, Lord, when will all of this cease? It seems like the wicked just prevail day in and day out. And so, God did not respond to Abraham in a negative way. He responded to him in a positive way. He told Abraham, find me 50 righteous people in this city, and I will spare everyone. Now, that seems like a small task. But considering the level of wickedness and sin in Sodom and Gomorrah, that became a real challenge for Abraham. So on that note, we move to our other verses, verse 18 and 30, and 18:31. Genesis 18:30. And he said unto him, oh, let not the Lord be angry, and I will speak. Peradventure, there shall be 30 found there. And he said, I will not do it, if I find 30 there. Genesis 18:31. And he said, behold, now I have taken it upon me to speak unto the Lord. Peradventure, there shall be 20 found there. And he said, I will not destroy 20 sake. Now, this is really getting down to the bare minimum. First, God said, find me 50 people that's righteous. Then I will spare the city. Then he said, well, find me 30 people that are righteous, and I will spare the city. And in verse Genesis 18:31, he said, just find me 20 people that are righteous. Now, when a world and a nation becomes so wicked that you can't find 20 righteous people, you're in trouble. And this city, Sodom and Gomorrah, was in trouble. There was not a sin for stone left unturned. There was everything going on in the city. But Abraham felt for the people, because Abraham felt that there has to be some good people in this city. And maybe there were 10 good people or 5 good people. But that was not the number that God gave Abraham to find. He started out giving the benefit, just find me 50. Now, if you have a city of 12,000 people and you can't find 50 righteous people, that says a lot for the level of sin taking place within that city. So, even though Abraham had this conversation with God, God persistently offered him a number that he would save the city based on that number. And basically, what Abraham interceded, he interceded because he knew God. He had a relationship with God. And so he felt like, I will appear on behalf of the people, because I believe that there are some righteous people, and I believe that the good should not suffer with the bad. So that's why Abraham interceded. But even though his confidence was grounded in obedience and his relationship, Abraham never basically became arrogant with what God had told him to do. So when we look at our next verse, Genesis 18:32, 1 John 5:14 and 15, Genesis 18:32, and he said, "Oh, let not the Lord be angry, and I will speak yet, but this once peradventure 10 shall be found there." And he said, "I will not destroy it for 10's sake." So 1 John 5:14, and this is the confidence that we have in him, that if we ask anything according to his will, he hears us. 1 John 5:15, and if we know that he hears us, whatsoever we ask, we know that we have the petition that we have desired of him. Now, Genesis 18:32 takes it down to a whole different level. Just find me 10 people. We're down to 10 people now, as far as being righteous in the city of Sodom and Gomorrah. But Abraham was confident. Abraham wanted to find 10 people. He felt himself there has to be at least 10 people. And, God didn't get angry with Abraham, because Abraham kept appealing to him. God kept giving him a different number every time. So God didn't become angry. He was giving him every opportunity to intercede on behalf of this wicked city. And so as they go in John 5:14 and 15, Abraham knew that what he requested would be granted based on God's stipulation. God didn't say he wouldn't save the city. He just said, just find me 10 people and I will save the city. So God did hear Abraham's prayer. He didn't get upset with Abraham. He just gave him some options. He didn't say, I'm not going to do it and get thee from me. Abraham appealed to God. Evelyn said, don't be angry. He said, I want to speak once again on behalf of the people. Abraham appealed to God 3 or 4 times. We know that based on the number that God gave, 50, 30, 20, and now we're down to 10 people. And so in verses 14 and 15 of John 5, it lets us know that if we petition God in confidence, he will hear our prayers. He will answer our prayers. And whatever we ask in his name, he will grant. So this is an interesting lesson, because if you think of everything that's going on, let's take in the city of Lansing, can you find 50 righteous people? 10 righteous people? It seems like an easy thing, but this was one of the most sinful cities in the Bible. And it ended up being destroyed because of that. But just think, a good-sized city actually, that you can't find 10 righteous people. And Abraham had a lot of feeling for the people. He said, surely goodness, there has to be some righteous. God said, I won't destroy the righteous if you find me 50 or you can find me 10. So he did not just ignore Abraham. He allowed Abraham to have options. He gave him 3 or 4 options. And so we know from a historical standpoint that Sodom and Gomorrah was destroyed. In our next set of scriptures, it addresses a different issue. It addresses the characteristics that we should have when we go to God in prayer. And the book of Luke is full of parables. So these next few verses, we get to the heart of real Christian characteristics and how we should approach God in our prayers today. And I'll read Luke 18, 9, 10, and 11. Luke 18, 9. And he spake this parable unto certain which trusted in themselves, that they were righteous and despised others. Luke 18:10. 2 men went up into the temple to pray. The one was a Pharisee, the other was a publican. Luke 18:11. The Pharisee stood and prayed thus with himself, God, I thank thee that I'm not as other men are, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even as this publican. Publican normally think of as tax collector. Some of them are tax collectors. Some of them run errands for the Roman government, and they are not very alike because they do work for the Roman government. But this is interesting because in these verses we start off looking at the difference between the approach of these two people. And so the first one in Luke 18 is open with the 2 parables. One deals with persistence, and the second deals with God's concern about how people should pray. So these 3 scriptures deal with the latter example of the Pharisee and the tax collector. The emphasis is on contrasting attitude in approaching God in prayer. The Pharisee prayed by comparing himself to those around him, whereas the tax collector approached God humbly. I think these are some important points because oftentimes we as Christians like to compare ourselves to the next person. And when really you might not have such a bold sin, but sin is sin. And so the Pharisees were known to be very arrogant. They were the rule setters and the leaders in the Jewish community. And so when time came to pray, the Pharisee went up and approached God in a different manner. He said, I'm not like the man standing next to me, a tax collector. I'm not an extortionist. I'm not an adulterer. And I'm not unjust. That's a very arrogant prayer to even begin to approach God with. But when you are self-centered, when you have too much pride, you're vain, and you have no humility, this is the kind of prayer that comes out of your mouth. And so that's what the book of Luke was about in these scriptures. And it goes on in Luke 18, 12, 13, and 14. Luke 18, 12. I fast twice in a week. I give tithe of all that I possess. This is the Pharisee talking. Luke 18, 13. And the publican, standing afar off, would not lift up so much as his eyes unto the heavens, but smote upon his breast, saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. Luke 18 and 14. I tell you, this man went down to his house justified, rather than the other. For everyone that exalted himself shall be abased, and he that humbles himself shall be exalted. Going back to verse 18 and 12, the Pharisee continued to brag about himself. People will say, I pay tithe, I fast twice a week. That's what the Pharisees were saying. And you have people who say, well, I give $5,000 each Sunday to church, or I give $5,000 a month to church. That doesn't get you anywhere if you have this attitude that the Pharisee had, that you can do no wrong. And because of what you do or don't do, that you are better than the next person. In other words, the humility goes out the window when you start to think like this. And that's what this parable is about. The Pharisees couldn't see himself as being vain. He couldn't see himself as having too much pride because he was too busy comparing himself with the next person. And many of us do that. Well, she's not all of that. I got 5 PhDs and they only got 1. But that's the wrong attitude to have. And the end of our verse says, a person who exalted himself too much will be humiliated, and he that is humble will be exalted in the end. You get to the point that you've become so self-absorbed that you really don't sometimes even realize that you are humiliating yourself by what you do. But it's the way in verse 13 that the tax collector went. He never looked up. He was humble before God. He said, I'm a sinner. That's the first thing he admitted, that he was a sinner. And so God was pleased with how he approached him. He didn't come to him saying, well, I'm better than the Pharisees who's over there in the corner bragging about what he does. He didn't do that. He failed to look up because it was a matter of being humble before God. And so God said, don't worry about it. The man who exalted himself will be humiliated in the end. But oftentimes we don't see the humiliation until it hits home, and sometimes it's very difficult to deal with. And so the Luke 18:14 say, they can exalt themselves all they want to. In the end, they will be the one humiliated. And on that note, we'll move on to some practical applications. The beginning of this lesson starts out with Abraham literally challenging God on why the good of Solomon must be destroyed along with the wicked. The important point here is because of Abraham's relationship with God, he felt that he could intercede for the righteous of the city. And when Abraham talked to God about it, we often find ourselves asking the same question. Why is it that those who are sinful and wicked appear to never suffer from their doings, but the good of those struggling to do what is right seem to always suffer in some manner? The other most important point is Abraham's approach in humility, reverence, and trust in God's mercy and justice. And Abraham knew that God would grant his wish if he could find those people that God asked him to find. And so, we do have to wonder. We look around and see what's going on in our world today, and it just seems like the wicked is running rampant. Just doing everything to seek out and destroy peace, seek out and to destroy people, nations, nationalities. And it's like, when is this going to end? And we always have to remember, God's time is not our time, but we still have to trust him that things will work itself out, will come to an end. So this is a good lesson on how we as Christians should approach God and others in daily living. It is often that we don't realize that our pride and arrogance can get in the way of our progress in our relationship with God. Sometimes we act as if we are in charge and God is there only for us. We saw that in our lesson between the prayers from the Pharisee and the tax collector. Humility was what brought attention to the tax collector, and his humbleness was what brought his attention from God. So as we go about our daily living, sometimes we just need to get in the quiet corner and ask ourselves, am I too vain? I mean, it's difficult to examine yourself sometimes. And that's why they make mirrors. Sometimes we just need to stand there for a minute. And even, we do that from a physical approach, a bodily approach. But sometimes we need to just say, who am I? Am I this vain person? Am I arrogant? Am I exalting myself too much? Am I thinking too much of myself? Because we get to the point, we think God is here to be at our beck and call, whether we're right or wrong. And He will answer prayers, but there's a certain approach that you have to have in going to Him. Respect, humility, and humbleness. So on that note, I hope this lesson has been beneficial to you, that as you go about your daily living with reverence and humility towards God and others, please continue to join us in our virtual lesson. Stay prayerful and observant in your daily response to societal changes. And thank you for listening.